The story begins even before the first victim exhales their final silence. In Sacramento, 7 digital influencers live in front of millions, unaware that every gesture, every vice, every display will soon be transformed into a sentence. A killer watches, not bodies but behaviors. He doesn't seek to hide, he seeks to reveal. And when screens begin to freeze, comments stop rolling, and an aged papyrus appears saying, "Sinner, you have been condemned." The city realizes it isn't dealing with a common criminal, but with someone who sees the internet as a public ledger of sins, and takes pleasure in destroying reputations before destroying lives. And for every digital sin, he leaves a symbolic body. But the ritual does not end at the 7th. There would still be a macabre surprise. Part 1. The story of this case doesn't begin with a frantic sequence of deaths in just a few hours. It builds itself like a slow, calculated, intelligent spiral, a ritual divided over 4 days, like chapters of a dark gospel rewritten for the age of screens. With each new murder, a new digital sin emerged, revealing that the criminal saw not urgency, but purpose, not blood, but moral symbolism. He wasn't eliminating people. He was eliminating digital characters, ego narratives, image constructions. Day 1. The first sin is revealed. Digital sloth. The first death occurs on an otherwise ordinary early morning. Tyler Grayson, the streamer who had turned his own procrastination into performance, is found lifeless in his stuffy studio. The gaming chair tipped over, the monitor frozen on his last live stream, a mosaic of screenshots curated by the killer, evidence of the addiction to inertia, as if each act he broadcasted had been a chapter in a morally flawed biography. Beside the body, the symbolic papyrus. "Sinner, you have been condemned. You have corrupted the laws of God." Police believe it to be an isolated homicide, a deranged follower maybe, but the signature is already there, a single, precise strike, as if attempting to wake him. The symbol of 7 concentric layers, a moral spiral only they would understand. Nothing, however, suggests that this would be only the beginning. Day 2. 2 new deaths make the city wake up. The second day rises with a kind of invisible unease. At 9:14 a.m., the second call comes in. Second death, digital pride. Drake Collins, a motivational coach known for excessive self-glorification, is found in a recording room almost too perfect, like a modern chapel dedicated to the worship of his own ego. The ring light still on, the screens displaying compilations of his superiority speeches. The papyrus with a cracked crown, representing pride collapsing onto itself. And again, the single strike, surgical, ritualistic. Police begin connecting dots, but hesitate. 2 influencers dead in 2 days could still be coincidence. Until late afternoon. Third death, the greed of digital luxury. Melanie Hart, a luxury lifestyle blogger, is found in her illuminated walk-in closet, surrounded by displays organized with almost religious precision. The killer touched nothing except the central table, where he arranged screenshots exposing the influencer's fixation on items, status, and value. The papyrus reveals a new symbol, a clenched hand over symbolic coins. Police no longer have doubts. Someone is killing digital influencers for their public sins. And at this exact point, at the end of the second day, Sacramento makes a decision that will change the entire course of the case. The MINDTRACE Division is called in. The team responds immediately. They are still mid-flight toward California when the third body is removed, and the city quietly realizes that someone is about to complete a kind of ritual. Day 3, the killer acts while MINDTRACE is still building the profile. MINDTRACE arrives in Sacramento at dawn on the third day. Liz Murray studies the moral pattern. Jay Carter analyzes the symbolic language of the collages. Mark Henderson evaluates the behavioral coherence of the strikes in the absence of struggle, but they have no time to breathe. At 11:21 a.m., the police radio erupts with noise. Fourth death, wrath as entertainment. Evan Roach, creator of reactive and inflammatory videos, is found in his garage studio. Tools aligned, cameras prepared, and at the center, a screen replaying his online outbursts. The papyrus displays stylized flames. MINDTRACE notices something unsettling. The killer is tracking police movements. He struck during the precise window when the team began constructing the investigative timeline. The case accelerates. At 5:40 p.m., another call. Fifth death. Digital envy. Sophie Legrand, model and influencer, is found before an LED panel looping photos of other models with higher engagement. The walls display printed private messages revealing hidden rivalries. The symbol on the papyrus, two overlapping eyes. MINDTRACE now sees a progressive, almost liturgical pattern. The killer does not hide. He performs. He sends messages through the victims themselves. And most disturbing of all, he is accelerating. Day 4, the ritual enters its final phase. As MINDTRACE watches the collapse. The fourth day begins with Sacramento wrapped in tense silence, as if the entire city knows the killer is not done. At 8:02 a.m., the official call comes in. Sixth death, gluttony as digital spectacle. Leon Vargas, the chef who turned food into performance, is found in his restaurant studio. No active kitchen, only printed images of his exaggerated, overproduced recipes, empty of meaning. The papyrus bears the circular symbol, the plate without limits. MINDTRACE now understands there is a specific moral order. The killer is replicating the 7 deadly sins, but not the original ones. He is recreating the sins as they exist within the contemporary digital world, reinterpreting behavioral vices as exposed spiritual flaws. But one is missing, and Liz knows. The last one is always the most symbolic. At 7:17 p.m. on the fourth day, Sacramento loses its breath. Seventh and final death. Social lust, the cult of image. Adrian Blake, fitness influencer, is found in his immaculate studio, surrounded by glowing panels and banners of his own brand. The killer left montages of altered photos, revealing Adrian's obsession with visual validation. The final papyrus bears a mirror broken in half. MINDTRACE arrives just minutes later. The killer nearly shares the same space with the team. The ritual is complete, but something in the pattern doesn't add up. 6 days? No. 4 days. A spiral of intensification, not a static ritual. Each death approaches the next as if the killer were trying to reach an emotional climax. 7 influencers. 7 sins reinterpreted through the lens of a contemporary fanatic. 7 exposed lives, judged and punished by someone who believes the internet has become a public confessional. And he, the executor of penance. And the message present at every scene becomes unmistakably clear. He believes he is correcting the world. He believes he is awakening sinners. He believes the feed is the new pulpit, and he, the final preacher. Try Part 2. The makeshift conference room inside the Sacramento Police Department looked like a hastily built stage prepared to host an uncomfortable truth. Screens scattered around displayed disconnected fragments of a case that, until then, local police had classified as an unusual set of ritualistic crimes, yet couldn't grasp the psychological depth behind its structure. It is into this setting that the MINDTRACE Division enters. The door opens without ceremony, but with the discreet authority of those who inhabit the terrain where human logic bends. The team positions itself almost instinctively. Dr. Liz Murray analyzes the environment with the silent precision of someone trained to interpret invisible nuances. Jay Carter studies maps and screens, searching for cognitive patterns. Mark Henderson reviews photographs and preliminary reconstructions, attentive to symbolic inconsistencies. Police tension dissolves slightly when Liz steps forward. Her presence is not one of command but of clarity. It is the kind of calm that emerges from someone who understands they are not investigating people but mentalities, and that this case, in particular, demands emotional and technical depth. The first contact with the pattern. The initial board displays the victims sequentially, not graphically, but as documentation. Liz observes the images from days 1 and 2 for long seconds, as if deciphering a secret language. She notes the absence of improvisation, the symbolic curation, the manipulation of screens as ritual tools, the absolute coherence between digital behavior and applied punishment. The killer does not attack the body. He attacks the public narrative constructed by the individual. Jay adds, "This ritual isn't about death. It's about the deterioration of image." He doesn't erase people, he erases characters. Mark advances with the spatial reconstruction. The single strike shows intent to awaken. The weapon isn't an instrument of violence, but of symbolic moral correction. He wants to cause interruption, not spectacle. Liz delivers the first official insight. We're dealing with a contemporary missionary profile. A building the baseline profile. MINDTRACE projects on the screen, a behavioral analysis model called the internal doctrine spiral, a theoretical structure describing criminals driven by rigid moral systems, usually derived from abusive trauma, religious indoctrination, or chronic feelings of inadequacy projected onto others. The killer in this case fits perfectly into the following points. 1. Fixation on collective moral order. He believes there is a correct path to live, not spiritual, but behavioral. He interprets the digital world as a showcase of sins. 2. Obsessive rigor with public judgment. The act of printing posts, compiling stories, and organizing collages reveals moral compulsion. He reads the internet as a courtroom. 3. Missionary behavior with a delusion of purpose. The repeated phrase on the papyri, "You have been condemned," is not a threat. It is a sentence, a liturgy. 4. Paraphilia centered on reputation destruction. The emotional pleasure is not in the act of killing, but in the symbolic downfall of image. He feeds on the public collapse. 5. Traumatic emotional root. Liz identifies clear signs of religious abuse in childhood. The way he writes, the type of distorted doctrine, the belief that there is a divine law for digital behavior, it all points to extreme moral conditioning. The temporal map, the pattern. The killer isn't hiding, the team reviews the entire timeline. Day 1, sloth. Day 2, morning, pride. Day 2, afternoon, greed. Day 3, morning, wrath. Day 3, afternoon, envy. Day 4, morning, gluttony. Day 4, night, social lust. Jay observes, he's accelerating. Each day has shorter intervals than the last. It's the final spiral of a purpose. He was waiting for us to be called. He wants a specialized audience. Liz adds, or he wants to be understood. Missionaries seek validation even when they punish. Mark points at the city map. All the crime locations form an arc. It's like he's marking symbolic territory, or moving toward a central point. The analysis triggers silence. Sacramento seems to contract, as if the map points not just to locations, but to memories. On the opposite wall, Jay projects the single phrase repeatedly found in digital devices, programmed by the killer. The feed reveals the sins the world insists on ignoring. Liz is the one who translates the phrase into its deeper meaning. To him, the digital world is an arena of involuntary exposure. People reveal fragilities without noticing. He believes he's correcting a moral imbalance in the collective. The digital world is a corrupted temple, and he sees himself as the restorer. Mark concludes he's not hiding anything, he wants to be decoded. And this is the most dangerous characteristic of a symbolic missionary. They only stop once they complete the purpose they've created, and there is no purpose without an audience. MINDTRACE is the final audience. The team realizes this on the second day, but the killer realized it from the first. Liz studies the tense faces of the local police. She takes a breath before stating, "He hasn't completed his ritual. It doesn't matter that 7 have died. His internal logic doesn't end at the 7th. It ends when his narrative is challenged, when his discourse meets resistance. And we are the resistance." The entire room falls silent. MINDTRACE was not called to decode a finished criminal, but to confront a criminal who had been waiting for them. Part 3. The light rain drifting over Sacramento that morning seemed to mirror the collective introspection inside MINDTRACE's analysis room. The walls were covered with boards, screens, and digital maps displaying the 7 crimes in chronological order. To an ordinary observer, they might appear as independent events connected only by thematic coincidence. But to that team, trained to detect patterns hidden beneath the surface, it was a system. A carefully engineered moral organism. The initial objective was not to hunt the killer, but to understand his mind, his rhythm, his symbolic grammar. The digital narrative as a battlefield. Liz projects at the center of the room a phrase that had become the case's mantra. The feed reveals the sins the world insists on ignoring. She walks slowly as she explains. The killer doesn't see the internet as a platform. He sees it as a confessional. Every post, every story, every comment is, to him, moral evidence. It's not about what the victims did in the real world, but about what they glorified in the virtual one. Mark adds, the printed paper, artificially aged, suggests he wants to collide timelines, to merge ancient morality with contemporary behavior. Jay highlights, the collage of screenshots isn't decorative, it's didactic. He creates educational panels at the scenes. He's a performative missionary. He wants to teach. The team agrees. The killer doesn't kill out of anger or impulse, but out of discourse. The architecture of the 7 sins, digital version. Jay begins analyzing the system the killer uses. 1. Digital sloth. Not classical laziness, but inertia turned into entertainment. The streamer who monetizes doing nothing. 2. Digital pride. The coach whose identity is built on fabricated moral superiority. 3. Digital greed. The blogger who accumulates symbols, not objects, feeding the cycle of social validation. 4. Digital wrath. The conflict creator who transforms aggression into interactive performance. 5. Digital envy. The model who lives through comparison, whose self-esteem depends on someone else's reflection. 6. Digital gluttony. The chef who amplifies visual excess as a form of emotional consumption. 7. Social lust. The fitness influencer whose identity is the display of the body as currency. Liz observes, he didn't reinterpret the sins. He updated them. He translated them. He took an ancient, rigid doctrine and reshaped it for the 21st century. The team realizes something essential. The killer is not punishing individuals. He is punishing behaviors he believes are idolized by the public. Temporal pattern. The escalation of fanaticism. Mark projects a graph showing the decreasing interval between crimes. Day 1, 1 crime. Day 2, 2 crimes. Day 3, 2 crimes. Day 4, 2 crimes. The rhythm accelerates because the closer he feels to completing the rite, the more urgent his mission becomes. Jay notes, this pattern isn't impulsivity, but rising fervor. He's approaching a final moment. The sense of destiny intensifies. To him, the 4th day is the peak of a sermon. Liz adds, obsessive missionaries don't stop at the climax, they seek the echo of the climax. The conclusion is clear. The killer needs MINDTRACE to finish his narrative. The team's presence is the final chapter, not an interruption. The single strike. A psychological key. All bodies showed the same pattern, a single precise blow to the head, with no signs of intense struggle. Mark analyzes. This reveals a core belief. One impact to wake, not to harm. He doesn't believe he is killing. He believes he is correcting. Liz deepens the idea. Missionary criminals build internal mythologies. For him, death isn't consequence, it's metaphor. He believes he is awakening dormant consciousness. Jay concludes, his discourse is bigger than the act. He doesn't want to destroy bodies. He wants to destroy narratives. This realization reshapes the whole investigation. The use of papyri, childhood as the root of the ritual. Liz studies the artificially aged papyri. She notices, the burned edges are more symbolic than aesthetic. The handwriting is restrained, rigid, almost catechistic. The paper attempts to mimic ecclesiastical documents but lacks real technique, an amateur imitating his childhood memory of liturgy. This becomes the first solid hint about the origin of his hysteria. This isn't imitation of actual doctrine. It's imitation of traumatic doctrine. It's the reconstruction of an old fear. He experienced intense religious judgment in childhood, not as a student, but as an emotional defendant. The profile begins to take shape, an adult punishing what he believes the world has become, but who is in truth only punishing the wounded child who was silenced. The city as a psychological stage. Jay overlays a city map with the geographic arc of the crimes. The route is not random. It forms a semicircle slowly converging toward Sacramento's old central district, an area marked by traditional churches, historic buildings, and community institutions. Liz identifies the meaning. He's returning to the origin. The end of his ritual is geographic. He is circling the emotional point that structures his story. Mark adds, missionary criminals tend to revisit locations tied to the beginning of their trauma. He's guiding us there. The team understands instantly. The killer isn't just executing victims. He is narrating his own story through them. First concrete profile hypothesis. The synthesis developed by MINDTRACE reveals male, between 25 and 40 years old, history of emotional or religious abuse, moral obsession, especially with public behavior, frustration with digital validation, high level of planning, low need for physical contact, sense of mission greater than life. Paraphilia centered on the ruin of image. But Liz raises an unsettling point. All the crimes so far are chapters, but none of them is the end. The end requires an antagonist, and he chose MINDTRACE for that role. The room goes silent, and so begins the most delicate phase of the investigation. Part 4. MINDTRACE always begins the reconstruction phase with the same philosophy. Before discovering who did it, we need to understand how he thinks while doing it. In this case, that maxim becomes even more critical. The killer does not act out of physical necessity, but ideological structure. Each crime is not just an act, it is a carefully composed chapter. Inside the room reserved for technical reconstruction, the three team members divide their tasks, but their analyses converge. The main board, illuminated by a soft light positioned exactly to avoid excessive shadows, displays a growing timeline. Days, hours, rhythms, spirals, symbols, movement patterns, and most importantly, psychological transitions between one murder and the next. The first day, the seed of the ritual. Liz begins by reconstructing the murder of Tyler Grayson. She examines the body's position, the angle of the fall, the nearby objects. There are three clear conclusions. The killer entered voluntarily or without resistance. Tyler likely knew him, or more likely did not fear him. Influencers frequently allow visits from photographers, technicians, partners, and selected followers. The killer hid himself within these roles. The single strike indicates a silent, almost ceremonial approach. This means the killer did not hide. He approached from behind or from the side, struck precisely, and then remained for several seconds beside the body, observing it. The ritual arrangement of the environment was done after death. The collage of screenshots, the aged papyrus, the phrase on the monitor, all created calmly. The criminal does not act in flight, he acts in liturgy. Jay adds, he isn't afraid of being discovered because he believes he's protected by his mission. True missionaries rarely anticipate punishment, since they see themselves as instruments of a higher order. Mark confirms, no signs of forced entry. He planned the first crime as an introduction, as a prologue. The first day is the birth of a moral structure. The second day, the construction of the discourse. Reconstructing the second day reveals even more. 2 murders, one in the morning, one in the late afternoon, indicate a structured rhythm. Nothing impulsive, nothing improvised. Murder of Drake Collins, the digital pride. Mark highlights, Drake's environment was a showcase of himself. The killer knows how to read the emotional setting of each victim. He doesn't take objects. He uses the theater they already built. Jay observes that the screen displaying the compilation of arrogant speeches was assembled by the killer. This means He studied the content deeply. He cataloged words, emotions, and behavioral patterns. He selected clips not by popularity, but by moral symbolism. Liz defines, "This is the first moment we see that the killer doesn't just want to punish. He wants to educate. He wants to show victims their moral reflection. It's a kind of twisted mirror." Murder of Melanie Hart. Greed. Reconstruction of the scene reveals something crucial: the meticulous organization of objects in the closet, the selection of printed photos, the central positioning of the table. Mark notes, "He composes the scene like a museum. Each victim becomes an exhibit." The word exhibit changes everything. Liz understands that the killer is constructing a narrative for later observers, police, specialists, whoever comes after. It is moral theater. The third day, the transition to visible fanaticism. MINDTRACE reconstructs the root of Day 3's crimes. Wrath in the morning, envy in the afternoon. Both scenes reveal cognitive acceleration in the killer. Evan Roach, Digital Wrath. Mark analyzes the garage. The killer didn't need to adjust anything. The nature of an aggressive content creator already provided the perfect symbolic theater. The killer's role was to select screenshots of outbursts, arrange them in rising intensity, position activated screens. Jay notices that this scene was assembled in less time than the previous ones. This indicates increased internal urgency, reduced need for aesthetic elaboration, rising moral fervor. Sophie Legrand, Digital Envy. The reconstruction reveals the killer used the influencer's own LED panel to project images of her rivals. He knew her digital environment. He knew specific rivalries. The selection was personal, not random. Liz concludes, "This is the first crime where the killer reveals intimate knowledge of the victim's emotional dynamics. He's studying people, not just profiles." Jay adds, "This is only possible with deep research. He monitors, compares, archives." The fourth day, the consolidation of the ritual. Reconstructing the crimes of the fourth day reveals something new, an intention to close the ritual. Leon Vargas, Digital Gluttony. The restaurant studio had been prepared hours before. The killer removed equipment without creating disorder. The organized prints showed the chef's transformation, from a simple cook to an emotional spectacle. Mark highlights, "He doesn't place food at the scene, because it's not about physical consumption. It's about emotional consumption online." Adrian Blake, Social Lust. Reconstructing this scene brings silence among the three agents. The broken mirror on the papyrus, the montage of altered photos left on the table, the studio lights still on. Liz identifies, "This is the only crime where the light is active in all directions." He wants to reveal something. He wants contrast. He wants to expose the contradiction between the idealized body and the real one. Jay observes, "The killer arrived minutes before MINDTRACE. He knew we were in the city. He wanted us to find this scene. He wanted proximity." The final pattern, the killer's route. With all reconstructions overlaid, Jay reveals the most disturbing element. The killer didn't create a random route. He drew something. The route of the 4 days resembles an arc converging toward the historic center, a semicircle closing on a symbolic point, a movement returning to the criminal's emotional origin. Liz confirms, "The last scene wasn't the end. It was the forward. He's guiding us to where he wants to be seen." The symbolic phase is over. The personal phase begins now. Mark concludes, "We reconstructed the crimes. Now we need to reconstruct the criminal." And with that, MINDTRACE understands, the killer has not finished anything. He has only completed the 7 chapters. Now he wants the epilogue. And that epilogue involves the team. Part 5. The behavioral analysis of a missionary killer is never just a simple list of characteristics. It is a gradual descent into the internal architecture of someone who transformed pain into doctrine. At this stage, MINDTRACE does not seek only to identify the profile, it seeks to understand him as a narrative structure. The collector of digital sins is not just a criminal, He is a wounded ideologue, a self-taught moralist, a compulsive restorer of an imagined order. In the analysis room, the lights are dimmed. Liz, Jay, and Mark move closer to the main board, now reorganized to display not the victims but the killer himself emerging from each pattern. They had reconstructed the deaths. Now, they would reconstruct the man. The fragmented identity, the self as inquisition. Liz begins with a sentence that summarizes the core of the case. He doesn't kill as an individual, he kills as an internal institution. The collector does not act as a person, but as a moral entity he believes he represents. His identity is fragmented among the wounded self, the child subjected to punishments, sermons, and religious humiliation, the observing self, the adult who sees the internet as a stage of exposure and moral disorder, the missionary self, the persona that emerges to correct what he perceives as public degeneration. These three layers coexist in conflict, but the third dominates all movement. Jay explains. He doesn't view his crimes as individual actions. He believes he is an instrument. He doesn't see choices, he sees duty. This partial dissociation reveals a form of structured moral delusion, not psychotic, but built over years of emotional repression. The origin trauma, the child who was never seen. When analyzing the style of the papyri, the cadence of the sentences, and the way the symbols are reused, Liz detects the deepest mark of all. The language is not adult. It is childhood language adapted, not in vocabulary, but in rigidity, in the lack of nuance, in the belief in absolute right and absolute wrong, in the idea of immediate punishment for any behavior considered sinful. Liz explains, in abusive religious environments, a child doesn't learn guilt, they learn dread, and that dread becomes a thinking structure. The world divides into sin and punishment, nothing more. This trauma now manifests as obsession with surveillance, need to police public behavior, inability to handle moral ambiguity, belief that every exposed error must be corrected ritualistically. The killer's childhood was a courtroom. Adulthood became symbolic revenge. The obsession with exposure, like culture. As Sinjay dives into the cognitive side of the profile, he notes the criminal printed posts, he printed comments, he reproduced stories, he organized behavioral mosaics. This reveals a compulsion that is not merely moral, it is paraphilic. His psychological pleasure is not in the violent act, but in cataloging public lives, identifying contradictions, highlighting behavioral vices, exposing the inconsistency between persona and reality. Jay defines, his paraphilia is the ruin of the image. He wants the digital mask to fall. He wants the reputation to collapse. He wants to be the agent who exposes what he believes is hidden. This obsession exists because he himself grew up being exposed as a sinner before authority figures. What was done to him, he now replicates on a digital scale. Contemporary missionary profile, the personal doctrine. Mark, a field profiling specialist, presents the model of traditional missionary criminals. Normally, they believe in divine mission, possess rigid morality, punish sinful behaviors, feel emotional gratification from delivering their own justice. But the collector is different. He is a missionary adapted to the digital age. His doctrine is based on public self-exposed sins. He does not search for secrets. He searches for celebrated vices. Judgment through performance. To him, digital behavior is more truthful than physical behavior. Moral ruin is penance. He stages scenes not for the police, but for the court of the public. There is catechetical intent, hybrid ritual aesthetics, ancient papyrus, plus modern screenshots, religious doctrine plus like culture. Single blow plus behavioral collage. Liz states, he doesn't want to save souls. He wants to restore a world he idealized in order to survive. The 7 sins architecture. Why 7? The use of the 7 deadly sins is not new in criminal psychology, but the way he adapts them is unprecedented. To the collector, sloth, abandoning real life for passive entertainment, pride, idolizing one's own success, greed, accumulating symbols of status, wrath, aggression as online spectacle, envy, torment through public comparison, gluttony, emotional excess served as content lust, the body as a product of social approval. This modern reinterpretation demonstrates above-average symbolic intelligence, deep knowledge of digital culture, ability to integrate theological concepts with contemporary behaviors, and extremely structured internal narrative. J signals, he isn't just killing, he's writing a manifesto. The moralistic paraphilia, pleasure in the fall mind trace, identifies an emotional pattern. The killer experiences euphoria not in the physical act, but in the moment he sees the victim's narrative collapse. His pleasure is in watching reputation crumble, watching the mask fall, watching the public discover the sin. This is a rare form of paraphilia, moral excitation through the destruction of persona. This paraphilia emerges when a child learns that public exposure is punishment. Shame becomes a tool of control. Traumatic religiosity fuses with humiliation. The individual grows seeking to invert the logic. If I suffered exposure, the world must suffer too. The collector's mind, the internal novel. Liz leads the final synthesis. The killer lives inside a theological authorial novel. He sees himself as forgotten prophet, moral judge, restorer of digital order, victim turned preacher, aggressor justified by personal doctrine. He does not see 7 crimes. He sees 7 chapters of a book he believes he is writing with his own hands. And Liz's next statement stills the entire room. There is an 8th chapter missing. A chapter that does not belong to the ritual, but to his story. He will still complete something personal, something not in doctrine, but in trauma. MINDTRACE understands. The collector is not finishing. He is beginning to reveal the true reason behind everything. Part 6. The 6th chapter of the investigation marks the transition between understanding and disorientation. Up until now, MINDTRACE had assembled a solid framework: probable identity, ritualistic modus operandi, distorted moral motivation, and childhood trauma as symbolic fuel. But no missionary criminal allows himself to be fully decoded, especially when his goal is not merely to kill but to be interpreted. On the morning of the 5th day, after the 7 murders, Sacramento wakes with a sensation that moves through the city like a whisper. Something is still happening. MINDTRACE arrives at police headquarters at 6:12 a.m. An anonymous call had been logged at 4:58 a.m. The voice was male, low, almost too controlled. There was no threat, no warning, only a single sentence. You counted 7, but God always counted 8. The silence following that statement becomes the killer's first direct psychological strike against the team. Jay analyzes the phrase as if it were code. 8 doesn't make sense in classical doctrine, so it's not about theology. It's about him, about his story. Liz adds, the 8th chapter is himself. The 8th sinner is always the author who refuses to admit he is a victim. But before this hypothesis can mature, Sacramento enters communicative chaos. At 7:40 a.m., hashtags begin spreading. 8th sin. Who is next? Message from the collector. It wasn't the killer who spread this. It was the public. The echo of his narrative. The collector knew this would happen, and he uses this reaction as fuel. Mark comments, he doesn't need to post anything. The public does the work for him. The criminal's mind does not operate only on victims. It operates on society. At 9:05 a.m., a newly created Instagram profile begins posting enigmatic messages with an aesthetic similar to the papyri. Phrases like, the sin of lies is the easiest to identify. The court of the public is the only just court. MINDTRACE does not see what is right before its eyes. Local police believe it's the killer. The media believes it. The public is certain. But MINDTRACE is not. Jay is the first to doubt. The cadence of the sentences is different. The visual style is cleaner, less handcrafted. The writing is more vain, less doctrinal. Mark reinforces, He would never use social media. He condemns digital exposure. He wouldn't mix himself with what he considers impure. Liz concludes, "This account is the work of opportunists. It has nothing to do with the collector." It is the first official false lead, but it won't be the last. At 11:20 a.m., the police identify a man named Daniel O'Keefe, 34, unemployed, with a strict religious upbringing, living in Sacramento, and a neighbor of one of the victims. He is the perfect suspect. Rigid, reserved, conservative online, disappeared on the night of the second murder. The police celebrate as though they've found the culprit. But MINDTRACE sees something no one else sees. Daniel is too rigid, too literal, too repetitive. His rigidity lacks the symbolic fluidity of the collector. Liz analyzes his psychological history. He is a product of the environment, not a creator of language. The collector is a distorted poet. Daniel is merely an echo. Jay observes, "The real killer would never produce something so predictable. Daniel doesn't create. Daniel repeats. Our criminal interprets." Mark concludes, "This suspect is a distraction. Maybe coincidence, maybe provocation." The false lead is dismissed. The third false lead, the planted object. At 2:17 p.m., a box is left anonymously at the police station reception desk. Blank address, no fingerprints. Inside, 7 small objects, 1 for each victim: a game controller, a tiny crown, a gold coin, a decorative lighter, a small mirror, a kitchen utensil, a fitness bracelet, all accompanied by the phrase, "Temptation always leaves traces. Follow what you wish to find." Police panic. It is the first time they receive something physical. But Liz spots the detail that dismantles the entire staging. The phrases on the papyri had doctrinal coherence. This one is ironic. The collector does not operate through irony. He operates through condemnation. Jay examines the glue used to attach the symbols. It's a different adhesive, different ritual, different style. Mark studies the handwriting. A bad imitation. MINDTRACE knows it is someone trying to participate in the case, not someone trying to finish it. The third false lead collapses. At 4:51 p.m., a man calls the police claiming to be the collector. His voice shakes. His speech is chaotic. He speaks in disconnected phrases. Police nearly mobilize the entire operation, but Liz asks to hear the full audio. She notices instantly. No ritual structure, no conviction, no moral authority, no calm, no purpose. He's an imitator, she concludes, or a desperate man trying to assume a role to justify his own pain. The false leads begin forming a pattern. The world tries to interpret the crime, but the crime has not yet revealed its true author. At 7:03 p.m., something different happens. A new box arrives, but this time addressed to MINDTRACE, not the police. Inside, only a single sheet of paper. You distract yourselves with shadows, but what I seek remains behind me, not before you. No object, no theatrical scene, no obvious symbol. Liz reads the sentence in silence. Jay examines every word. Mark notes that there is no signature, but Liz whispers what no one else has said yet. This is not a false lead. This is the first real clue. He wants us to understand his past. He wants us to find the place where everything began. The team realizes the false leads were never meant to confuse the police. They were meant to isolate MINDTRACE until only the real path remained. And now, finally, the real path is open. Part 7. The MINDTRACE analysis room is silent. Not the silence of absence, but the dense silence that emerges when everyone realizes they are just steps away from something essential, something that had always been in plain sight, yet no one had connected until now. On the table lies the last clue sent by the killer. You distract yourselves with shadows, but what I seek remains behind me, not before you. Liz reads the sentence again, now more slowly. Jay studies the digital files. Mark revisits maps that had already been dismissed. It is in this moment that the crucial discovery begins to surface. The sentence sent by the killer is not symbolic. It is both literal and metaphorical. Jay is the first to understand. The internet is what stands in front of people, everything exposed, everything displayed. But he says what truly matters is behind him, behind his persona, behind the moral mask, behind the doctrine. Liz adds, he's talking about the past, the origin, the unresolved root, the exact place where his ideology was born. And Mark, mapping the killer's roots, confirms the final missing piece. The geographic path converges toward Sacramento's historical zone, but not toward the center, toward something specific. The team moves around the enlarged map. At the intersection of all symbolic routes, there is an old neighborhood, nearly invisible to modern eyes. And within it, a single point that had never been analyzed. An abandoned religious children's school, inactive for almost 2 decades. St. Miriam's House of Discipline. The name reverberates like a cracked bell in the team's subconscious. Jay murmurs, House of Discipline, moral discipline, punishment, children, public shame. Everything converges. Liz closes her eyes for a moment. The final piece locks into place. The school is where he was shaped, where he learned to feel guilt as language, where public exposure was a tool of control, and the sentence sent to MINDTRACE is not merely direction, it is confession. Liz asks forensic techs to bring the original papyri. She holds them under the dim light. She runs her fingers along the artificially burned edges, studies the rigid handwriting, the spacing of the words, the meticulous yet infantilized calligraphy. And then she sees, it is not just aged paper. It is institutional paper, the kind used in old religious school activities, with a texture similar to didactic moral worksheets. Jay analyzes the material chemically. The paper type resembles that used in the old school, not because it was taken from there, but because the killer tried to reproduce the texture of his childhood. Liz states, he is trying to rewrite his own pain. The paper in the crimes is the emotional paper he was given as a child. The team understands. The papyri are symbolic reconstructions of the punitive assignments once imposed on him. Each murder is a lesson, each scene, an inverted sermon. Jay revisits the phone call phrase, you counted 7, but God always counted 8. Until now it had been interpreted as provocation, but Liz sees the real meaning. The 8th is not a victim. He never spoke about killing someone else. He spoke about completing. And then, the revelation. The 8th chapter is the public revelation of himself. The moment he stops being watcher and becomes the accused. The moment he exposes his own story, his final version of sin. It is not about a new crime, but about absolute exposure. The same exposure he imposed upon the victims. And where will he do this? Mark answers without hesitation. In the place where he was first exposed, St. Miriam's House of Discipline. The killer's mind is about to return to the cradle of its trauma. Jay realizes there is a hidden thread between the victims, a thread no one noticed because they kept looking at the surface. He reorganizes the screens. The sloth streamer was beloved by the public. The pride coach was highly praised. The greed influencer was celebrated for showing off. The wrath creator was followed for his outbursts. The envy model was admired for others' beauty. The gluttony chef was applauded for excess. The lust fitness influencer was idolized for his body. Jay then says the line that changes everything. They were celebrated for their sins. Liz gives a sad smile. The smile of someone who finally understands the enemy. The killer is attacking the public, not the victims. The victims existed only to represent the vices everyone consumes. The real target has always been the audience, the cult of exposure, the culture of digital idolization. He is punishing the world, not individuals. Mark concludes, and his final punishment will be self-exposure, the ultimate act of destruction against himself. MINDTRACE understands. The ritual is about to close in on its author. As she folds the map, Liz notices that the rote of the 7 murders, seen from above, forms something symbolic, an open spiral converging toward the religious school. The same spiral on the papyri, the same spiral of trauma, the same spiral of his doctrine. Jay breathes deeply. He is returning to be condemned in the court of his childhood. Liz concludes, "The central insight is this. He never wanted to run. He wanted to be found, but only when he was ready to reveal who he truly is. And that moment has just arrived." Part 8. St. Miriam's House of Discipline rises before MINDTRACE like a forgotten monument to pain. The building, abandoned for years, carries in its architecture the weight of rigid belief. Narrow windows, thick walls, hallways far too long for small children. Nothing there was built to welcome, only to contain. The wind slips through the cracks in the roof with a whispering sound, as if the structure remembers the silent screams it once witnessed. It is in this setting that the collector chooses to reveal himself. The team arrives at the location at dusk, as the golden light fades, leaving the environment washed in the bluish-gray tone of repressed memory. No movement, no sound, except the distant echo of the past. Mark, positioned at the front, examines the entrance. Jay's digital tablet illuminates structural maps. Liz walks with controlled firmness, knowing this confrontation will not be physical, but psychological, perhaps the most dangerous kind. The door creaks when opened, as if protesting against the return of someone who once fled its walls. The interior of the school is organized, and that is the first surprise. No chaos, no destruction, no signs of forced entry. There is order. A ritual order, a childlike order recreated by adult hands. The tiny desks have been aligned. The walls display sheets resembling the papyri, each representing one of the 7 digital sins. And at the back of the room, at an old principal's desk, sits him, the collector, seated, motionless, head lowered, not like a predator, but like a student waiting to be reprimanded. The infantilized posture is immediate, tensed shoulders, knees together, hands interlaced with mechanical discipline. Liz doesn't need him to introduce himself. She already knows she's standing before someone who spent a lifetime trying to recreate this moment, the return to the moral tribunal of childhood. While the police would prefer to handcuff him, bark orders, or assert authority, MINDTRACE knows this would shatter the only emotional bridge possible. Liz lifts her hand, signaling no one should approach abruptly. Jay analyzes his behavior. Absence of escape, absence of resistance, absence of visible anxiety, presence of ritualistic expectation. Mark identifies no weapon, no aggressive intention, no object posing immediate threat. Liz understands the dynamic. He is not there to attack. He is there to be read, to be decoded, to finally be understood. The collector slowly raises his face, but he does not look at Liz. He looks behind her, toward the doors, toward the empty hallways, toward the space where institutional authority once stood. It is a look that asks, "Who judges me now?" Liz answers with silence, the kind of silence that says, "I did not come to punish you. I came to understand the size of your pain." That silence disarms him more deeply than any handcuffs. He finally lifts his eyes and meets Liz's gaze. There is no fury, no triumph. There is fear, old fear, learned fear. And then he whispers, with a voice broken not by malice but by memory, "You came to condemn me." It is all he knows. It is all he was trained to expect. But Liz does not answer with condemnation. She answers with something far more destructive to his internal doctrine. "We are not here to condemn you. We are here because someone hurt you first." It is as if the air is ripped from the room. The sentence strikes the only pillar that still held him upright, the belief that he was the moral agent, not the victim. His breathing falters, his shoulders tremble. The rigidity of the missionary breaks, revealing the boy who carried the tribunal on his back for decades. The collector tries to regain firmness, but his internal narrative is fracturing. He murmurs, "They showed their sins publicly. I needed to wake them." Liz replies slowly, "You weren't waking anyone. You were reconstructing every punishment you received in here. The single strike wasn't for them. It was for you, for every time they told you that you were flawed. He closes his eyes as if the words were too bright, hitting the parts of him he tried to bury. Jay adds, "You were never chasing influencers. You were chasing versions of them that looked like versions of you, the ones they tried to silence." Mark completes, voice firm yet compassionate. "And in the end, you came back to the only place you ever wanted to understand." The collector brings his hands to his face, not in despair, but in revelation. A physical confrontation was never needed. He does not attempt to flee, does not try to defend himself, does not try to justify anything. He simply surrenders to his truth. MINDTRACE knows this is the only possible capture for someone whose paraphilia is the collapse of his own narrative. Liz steps forward, a small distance physically, an immense one emotionally. She says with calm voice, "The 8th chapter was you." And he responds for the first time without fear, "I always knew." It is the end of the antagonist, not by force, not by intimidation, but by internal revelation. The collector rises slowly without resistance, and the handcuffs are placed on him with the care given not to a criminal, but to someone surviving himself. The documentary camera pulls back. The evening light spills into the hallway. The past finally closes. Part 9. The late afternoon light filters through the narrow windows of the old St. Miriam's House of Discipline, creating diagonal beams that cut the air in fine particles of dust. It is a setting suspended between past and present, a temporal border where the killer's memories blend with the final act of his missionary journey. The collector stands calmly, handcuffs on his wrists. There is no physical resistance, but there is something deeper. Symbolic resistance. The kind that lives inside someone whose entire life was structured around guilt and expiation. And MINDTRACE knows. Physical capture is only half of the real capture. The other half happens inside his mind. Mark escorts him through the school's main hallway. Each step echoes like repetition of the past, and the collector feels it. The old doors still carry marks of children's fingernails, scratches, scrapes. On one of them, there are remnants of paint where, decades ago, children were forced to write punitive sentences, the same cadence that now appears in the papyri left at the crime scenes. The collector slows down and stares at one of these doors. His voice comes out low, almost inaudible. "I stayed there. Every day. It was always the same sermon." Liz stays a few steps behind, studying his body. She notices retracted shoulders, shorter breathing, eyes fixed on the past, the return of childlike rigidity. He is not remembering. He is reliving and that's when the psychological capture completes itself. He understands that the childhood tribunal still lives inside him, and that the entire ritual of the 7 sins was merely an attempt to recreate the only scenario he knew as emotional justification. When they reach the main hall, he stops abruptly. The light hits his face, revealing a mixture of relief and devastation. He turns to Liz. "So it's over?" The question is not about prison, it is about mission, about identity, about purpose. Liz answers with the emotional precision this case demanded. "It's over because the narrative you built can no longer sustain the pain you tried to hide. You didn't need to punish the world. You needed to understand yourself." He closes his eyes, not in resistance but in emotional surrender. Jay observes the subtle shift. Facial muscles relax, his chest stops tensing, the handcuffed hands stop moving. What collapsed was not the criminal. It was the internal doctrine that kept him functioning. As the group walks through the main doors, police officers, forensic teams, and external units step aside in formation. Absolute silence. No one celebrates. No one shouts. It is as if everyone in that courtyard understood they had not captured a monster, but someone born from the absence of care, the distortion of faith, and moral solitude. The documentary camera follows the slow, almost liturgical movement. The collector descending the steps of the school where his childhood ended and where his adult ritual began. The contrast is brutal. He entered alone in pain. He is leaving accompanied by the understanding of his own moral madness. Mark observes, he doesn't look at anyone. He doesn't acknowledge police or journalists. He only looks at the ground. Liz replies softly, because the only gaze he fears meeting is the child he was in here. When they reach the car that will take him to the detention center, he finally speaks again. His voice is low, but steady. I didn't want to kill anyone. I just wanted to wake them. Liz steps closer, slowly. But no one was asleep. Only you. The sentence breaks the final pillar of his doctrine. He swallows hard. The tears don't fall, but his eyes shine as if fighting them. He murmurs, "Why did they show that about me? Why did they say I was the mistake? I just wanted to be good." And Liz ends the cycle with the hardest phrase to hear, but the only one capable of disarming him completely. Someone taught you to confuse suffering with virtue. The collector takes a deep breath. A long breath, almost an internal collapse. He does not fight, does not resist, does not try to escape. He simply enters the car, as if accepting for the first time that he no longer needs to be judge nor victim but of himself. In the distance, murmurs, cameras, journalists, and drones can be heard. The entire city had followed the case. Influencers commented. Media outlets speculated. Hashtags rose and fell like digital tides. But when the collector crosses the outer perimeter, something unexpected happens. The crowd goes silent. Not out of fear, not out of respect, but because in that instant, they realize that much of what they do online, constant exposure, idolization, easy attack, instant judgment, resembles, even if distorted, the same condemnations the collector carried out. For a few seconds, it is as if everyone sees themselves in the twisted reflection of what he became. And the documentary camera captures the moment with poetic precision. A missionary killer being taken away in silence by a public that, in some way, helped feed the very patterns that destroyed him. The police vehicle doors close. The sound is sharp, final, symbolically heavy. It is the end of the collector's ritual, but also the beginning of something he never had. The possibility, even late, of facing his pain without turning it into doctrine. Liz watches the car depart. Mark takes a deep breath. Jay turns off the tablet. The team does not celebrate, does not cheer. Because MINDTRACE does not chase criminals. They chase thoughts and behaviors. And in that moment, they had captured both. Part 10. Some cases close investigations, others close cycles. But this one closes mirrors. Because the collector of digital sins was not just the story of a missionary killer, shaped by the rigidity of an authoritarian childhood and the moral solitude of an environment that confused discipline with torment. It was also the story of a world that learned to transform behavior into spectacle, pain into content, and self-worth into currency. At the end of this investigation, Sacramento woke quieter, not because the killer was gone, but because of what he revealed. The victims were not chosen for who they were, but for what they represented in a culture that lives to watch itself, compare itself, and display itself. And the criminal, distorted by emotional abuse, took upon himself an impossible mission: to correct, alone, what the entire world reproduces every day. The compulsive need to be seen, approved, celebrated. MINDTRACE understood that none of the 7 digital sins existed solely in the victims. They existed in the systems that fuel that cycle, algorithms that reward excess, audiences that chase extremes, and people who build versions of themselves more desirable than truthful. The collector, in his fragmented pain, believed he could break that cycle through symbolic punishments. But his failure was fundamental. He replicated exactly what he tried to fight. Punishing what is exposed, humiliating what is visible, correcting behavior through the force of public judgment. And thus, his story becomes not only a personal tragedy, but a reflection of the modern relationship with identity itself. Liz Murray saw this in the final scene of the investigation. As the car carrying the collector drove away, she didn't see just a captured criminal. She saw an entire culture trapped in the same invisible tribunal that shaped him. A tribunal that punishes without mercy, that points out flaws as spectacle, that demands impossible perfection and forgets that sometimes what appears on the screen is not sin. It is simply someone trying to survive. Jay Carter summarized it accurately. The collector didn't hate the victims. He hated the feeling that the world was celebrating what had been used to destroy him. And Mark Henderson added, "Those who grow up being punished for their own humanity grow up believing everyone should be punished for it." The narrative ends with a kind of bitter poetry. The 7 digital sins were never about religious morality. They were about human vulnerability exposed on a stage that never closes. As MINDTRACE returns to Washington, they carry the final lesson of this case. The thoughts we chase say more about the world we build than about the criminal we interpret. And sometimes crime is only the late consequence of a trauma no one saw happening. And so the episode ends, with the city in silence, the tribunal dismantled, and the mind finally deciphered.